Thank you, NAPSA, for inviting me here today. I'm looking forward to meeting many of you and learning from you at the conference this week. As Penny mentioned, I've been asked to share with you tonight a look at the state of bail reform in the United States, a topic I've delved into as a journalist covering criminal justice issues in the Midwest. And it's been quite a year for reform. So in the next half hour or so, my goal is to give you three things: an understanding of where things are changing, why things are changing, and some of the biggest obstacles to broad-scale reform. And we'll be able to continue this discussion tomorrow morning at the panel. But before we dive into all of this, I think it's worth taking a moment to remember just what's at stake when we talk about bail reform. The Department of Justice estimates that 450,000 people are stuck in limbo every day, in prison before their day in court. And many of these people are there because of unaffordable cash bonds. Now, in Cook County alone, the county that Chicago is in, which is home to the country's largest single-site jail, the numbers are staggering. According to the Sheriff's Office, more than 60% of those awaiting trial are there because they cannot afford to pay their bond. That's over 4,000 people on any given day. And they're people like Lavette Mays, who I met while reporting a story in Chicago. Lavette was arrested for battery in March 2015 after a fight with her mother-in-law in the course of a messy divorce. Now, before her arrest, she owned a home where she raised her 2 children and ran a small business transporting kids to and from school. But all of that changed when she went to jail. Lavette's bond was posted at $250,000, and her friends and family were unable to come up with the $25,000 she needed to walk. Finally, after 14 months in jail, she received support from the Chicago Community Bail Fund and was able to post bond. But by that time, however, Lavette had lost her home and business, depleted her savings, and missed the graduation of her son from kindergarten and her daughter from junior high. She ultimately pled guilty because she was afraid that she was going to lose custody of her children. She did not have to serve any time in prison, however, because her time in jail outnumbered the days in her sentence. Now, Lavette has been unable to find work since then because of her time in jail and still relies on family members for housing. To this day, her children make her promise to come home soon whenever she leaves the house. Lavette's situation is not unique, and I think everyone sitting in this room today knows that using bail to hold people before they go to trial can perpetuate cycles of poverty, incarceration, and racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. Now, the good news, however, is that more and more people are recognizing these problems and trying to change how bail works, and we may finally be at a tipping point for reform. In the last 2 years, there's been a wave of reforms taking place in states as diverse as Kentucky and Colorado. Now, this is a far cry from just a decade ago when Washington, D.C. was the real outlier in bond reform. Now, here's a nice map that The Guardian put together a couple weeks ago using data from the Pretrial Justice Institute. The darker the color, the farther along the state is in implementing bail reform. Now, The Guardian has 7 states listed as having not done any bail reform, but it doesn't take into consideration the various local jurisdictions that have worked on reform in those states. 2017 has been especially exciting, with New Jersey and Maryland dramatically overhauling the way they use cash-based bail. New Jersey's stipulation that judges must consider the least restrictive pretrial conditions possible, barring public safety issues, has meant big changes on the ground. In the first 3 months of implementation, judges set just 8 money bails out of around 6,000 criminal cases. Jail population went down dramatically. Now, not all the reforms happening across the country look the same. And I think this is an important point when we're talking about the wave of reforms we've seen in recent years. Some places are making changes incrementally by making some crimes explicitly cash bail free or adding checks and balances to the pretrial process, while others are making big changes that remove cash from the equation altogether. And not all these changes are happening at the same level. In fact, often we see different levels of the government working on the issue, sometimes in concert with each other, sometimes separately. In the case of Chicago, for example, in the last 6 months alone, we've seen big changes made at both the state level with a new law and at the county level with changes in policy by the state's attorney and circuit court. The wave of changes across the United States has led some to believe that we're seeing the third generation of bail reform. In an interview earlier this year, Harvard Law School's Larry Schwartzel told me, "We're really at an amazing moment with bail. There is a really extraordinary wave of momentum to change in pretty fundamental ways how bail works." Similarly, earlier this year, Timothy R. Schnacky of the Center for Legal and Evidence-Based Practices wrote, "Bail reform is unavoidable and will happen in every state in America. If it does not come from states desiring to change on their own, it will come from states being forced to change by the courts." Now, this is a big change from even a couple years ago when D.C. Superior Court Judge Truman Morrison said he was pessimistic about the prospects for bail reform nationwide. In an interview this spring, he told me that he's now fairly optimistic that there's some momentum building. So where is this momentum for change coming from? I believe it's coming from 3 places: the courts, the lawmakers, and community activists. Now, the first group Schnacky mentioned earlier, and Penny also mentioned in her presentation. We've seen dozens of lawsuits critical of cash bail in the last 2 years. One group of lawyers, the Civil Rights Corps, has brought 20 cases to court against cash bail programs, and they currently have 9 cases open in Georgia, Texas, Illinois, Massachusetts, Alabama, California, Louisiana, and Tennessee. They have targeted both small jurisdictions and big cities and counties. These lawsuits have been bolstered by the amicus brief that President Obama's Department of Justice issued last year in Walker v. City of Calhoun. And they've gotten further support from the precedent-setting decision this spring in McGruder et al. V. Harris County. There, a judge ruled that incarcerating people pre-trial solely because they cannot afford to pay bond violates the equal protection and due process clauses of the U.S. Constitution. Now, one of the interesting things about the lawsuits that the Civil Rights Corps and others have been pursuing is that they are motivating change through the fear of litigation. In other words, when a group files a lawsuit outlining the ways that a town's handling of bail is illegal, and a judge then outlaws those practices, neighboring towns and cities take note. Often they are using bail in the same way, so they change their practice quickly to avoid being sued. Now, a second pressure group has been lawmakers. We've seen a convergence of conservative and liberal lawmakers over criminal justice reform in recent years, which I think has been key on this issue. In Illinois, we see it from our Republican governor who has signed bail reform law and pushed for reducing prison populations in the name of fiscal frugality and public safety. Lawmakers like Governor Bruce Rauner have been convinced by studies that have shown that bail is contributing to a booming prison population. We know, for example, that low-risk defendants detained before trial are 4 times more likely to receive a sentence of imprisonment and 3 times more likely to be given a longer prison sentence than those released before their trial. Lawmakers have also been convinced by new data that shows that government agencies lose money on bail programs. In a study released in January, the Vera Institute of Justice found that although government agencies in New Orleans receive $4.5 million a year in revenue from bail and other fees, the city pays $6.4 million annually to jail people who cannot afford bail. A separate study released last year from Washington, D.C., which releases 90% of defendants without bond, found that this D.C. saves $398 million a year by releasing defendants. These are impressive numbers to lawmakers who are looking to save taxpayers' money. Bail reform can be attractive to even so-called law and order advocates looking to reduce crime. We know that compared to low-risk defendants held for no more than 24 hours, those held for 8 to 14 days are 56% more likely to be rearrested before trial and 51% more likely to recidivate after sentence completion, hardly making cities safer. Finally, there is a fear also among lawmakers that our current cash bail system is letting dangerous individuals with connections to well-financed criminal networks buy their way out of jail. Now, I think there are some problems with this line of logic, but it has become a popular argument for reform. In December, for example, Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson noted that people arrested on gun charges in Cook County were 6 times more likely than shoplifters to post bond. Johnson explained, "The gangs will put their money together because they want to get that guy out, because he'll go get the rival gang member that they're trying to get. So no matter how high we push it up there, they're going to figure out a way to get this guy out of jail." Similarly, GOP Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey joined the ACLU in lobbying for bail reform measures that went into effect in the state, in part because he was convinced of bail's ineffectiveness in keeping dangerous defendants off the streets. A third push for change has been coming from community activists, particularly local bond funds. Now, in recent years, community-led bond funds have been popping up in cities across the nation, raising money to bail people out of jail who are awaiting trial. Funds currently exist in New York, Massachusetts, California, North Carolina, Connecticut, and Illinois. The Chicago Community Bond Fund has posted bonds for 89 people since December 2015 and helped release them from jail or home confinement. Over half of these individuals have since had their cases resolved and returned the money to the organization. Most of the bonds the fund posts are around $5,000, so not very high. Funds are pushing for reform in several ways. First, they are putting a human face on the issue and creating a platform for freed clients to lobby for change. Too often, we only hear about the people affected by cash bond when something horrific happens. Khalif Browder's 3 years in Rikers Island because he could not pay his $3,000 bond made headlines, as did Sandra Bland's death in Texas. But we rarely hear from the majority of people affected by money bond. With the support of the Chicago Community Bond Fund, Lavette Mays and others now speak frequently to the press and lobby lawmakers for change. They've also lent their support to lawsuits challenging bail systems. Now, secondly, funds like Chicago's have highlighted a flaw in the underlying assumptions of the bond system. They've demonstrated that you don't need to put money in the balance in order for people to show up to court. Funds are also getting savvier about pushing for reforms. In Chicago, the Bond Fund has trained over 100 court watchers to observe the changes that are being implemented in the courts this fall, and they are planning on releasing a report of their findings. Nationally, bond funds are also starting to collaborate. Last month, representatives from funds across the country convened in Brooklyn as part of the National Bail Fund Network. And now they are having monthly meetings to pool resources, exchange tactics, and share philosophies. With this unity, I think we'll be seeing bigger things in the months ahead from the funds. And this is all good news for people interested in bail reform. But it's not time to pop the champagne yet. The end of cash bail is not inevitable, and there are many roadblocks ahead. Some of these obstacles are old, like the billion-dollar bail bond industry. The industry's reach is far. Illinois is one of only 4 states without a private for-profit bail bond industry, and the industry has been making its voice heard as states move away from cash bail. This summer, 2 lawsuits underwritten by the bail industry were filed in federal district court in New Jersey, challenging that state's new law that eliminated most cash bail. Now, their opposition to reform is understandable. The New Jersey bail bond industry has seen its profits plummet since the law took effect there at the start of the year. In addition to the lawsuits, the industry has been trying hard to show a kinder, gentler face to companies. In February, bondsman Chris Blaylock launched usbailreform.com in order to show what he calls the human side of bail and to expose the dangers of taxpayer-funded criminal justice reform. The American Bail Coalition and various bail bond companies fund his site. Blaylock tries to paint people in the industry both as heroes of public safety and saviors to those trying to get bailed out of jail. He writes about people accused of crimes who were released under bail reform measures. Now, a recent headline reads, "Prior convicted felon charged with possession of gun and meth, free to go under New Mexico bail reform." At the same time, Blaylock recounts how his parents, also bondsmen, would drive in the middle of the night to bail out clients and sometimes give their clients a ride home and something to eat. How persuasive is this often contradictory rhetoric to courts and the public? Not very. On Thursday, a judge denied the industry's request to block New Mexico court judges from using new pretrial release and detention rules. And only the week before, the New York Times decried the industry as cash bail's lonely defender. In an editorial, they wrote, "The momentum in favor of reform is already strong as more people come to see how pointless and unfair the cash bail system is. If the forces behind this morally tainted enterprise want to think of it as a war, they should go right ahead. They're going to lose." If the bail bond industry is a fading obstacle, one that is becoming more visible is the fear of risk assessment technology and the big data algorithms used in places that are enacting bail reform. I know this is something that a lot of you will be talking about in the coming days at the conference, but as someone outside of the pretrial services industry, I can tell you that there are real concerns among everyday people about the use of such technology and how it might endanger public safety and increase racial profiling. Both law and order advocates and civil liberties proponents have found common cause in attacking this technology. Last year's ProPublica investigation into North Point's Compass tool found that their formula falsely flagged Black defendants as future criminals at almost twice the rate as white defendants, and it mislabeled white defendants as low risk more often than Black defendants. While we can hope that North Point has improved its algorithms since then, race continues to be a thorny issue with risk assessment technology. Similarly, suspects released due to their low score, who later reoffend, shake the public's confidence in the system. Last month, we saw this headline at NPR about the Arnold Foundation's public safety assessment tool. Did a bail reform algorithm contribute to this San Francisco man's murder? It's pretty scary stuff. In the article, the head of San Francisco's pretrial diversion project tells NPR that her staff incorrectly entered data about a suspect into the tool, and the mistake apparently gave the man a lower score than he should have had and prompted the judge in the case to release him. Once freed, the suspect is believed to have killed Edward French, a professional film and video and TV scout. Last week, we also saw the San Juan County District Attorney criticizing the Arnold tool after a suspect who was released based on his score died in a shootout with New Mexico State Police. While the number of people who commit violence after being released before their trial may be small, each instance gives credence to those calling for a return to old cash bond systems. So concerns about technology will pose real challenges to reformers in the days ahead. But I think the bigger question moving forward is whether any of these so-called reforms actually make a difference. This is important because reform, after all, is pointless if it makes little impact on the problems it purports to solve. Now, take Cook County, for example, which has enacted 3 changes in the last 6 months. In March, we had Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx move to release inmates with bonds of $1,000 or less who could not afford them. This step was widely praised as a victory for reform, but in reality, it affected just a few dozen of the 7,400 inmates in jail at the time. Then in June, Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner signed the Bail Reform Act, which goes into effect next year. This established the right to public defender in bond hearings, stipulates that judges use the least restrictive conditions necessary to ensure the appearance of someone in court, and creates a path for people charged with nonviolent misdemeanors and low-level felonies to have a rehearing on the amount of their bail if they cannot afford to pay it. The act does not create hard limits on the use of monetary bond, however, and a rehearing does not guarantee that their bond amount will be lowered. For these reasons, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart has said the act will do little to change the number of people held in Cook County Jail pre-trial. Finally, in July, Chief Judge Timothy Evans of the Circuit Court of Cook County announced General Order Number 18.8A. This order directs judges to set monetary bonds only in amounts people can pay and goes into effect next week for felony cases and next year for all cases. Now, this change is expected to make a big difference in Cook County if it's followed. But since it's just a rule change, the next judge could get rid of it altogether, so it's really not a permanent fix. With this in mind, representatives from the Chicago Community Bail Fund and the Civil Rights Corps will appear in court tomorrow at the first major hearing for their lawsuit challenging money bond in Cook County. So the battle for meaningful reform continues. Reform takes time, and it may come, as it has in Illinois, incrementally. We need to be cautious about celebrating the end of cash bail too soon, especially when there are so many competing models to reform out there. And ensuring that reforms are permanent and enforced across the board will be important to long-term change. So are we at a tipping point for bail reform? I'm optimistic that we'll see big changes ahead, but the path forward won't be easy. And for the 4,000 people sitting in Cook County Jail tonight, awaiting their trial because they cannot afford their bond, people who have houses, jobs, and children, these changes cannot come fast enough. These people are counting on people like you and journalists like me to continue pushing for change. Let's not let them down. Thank you.